She wasn't supposed to be outside. But there she was, coat half-zipped, cheeks frozen, eyes locked on the gate. "Are you okay?" he asked. She just shook her head and whispered, "My mom is still in there." Billionaires do not typically visit orphanages, not on gray afternoons when the sky seems to weigh heavy over the city, and certainly not with rain sliding in cold sheets across the sidewalks. Yet that was exactly the sort of day it was, and exactly what Charles Wyatt did. His arrival was marked only by the smooth purr of his car engine and the quiet closing of the door behind him. Charles was a man accustomed to boardrooms and crystal glasses, not cracked pavement and the distant, uncertain laughter of children. He hesitated outside the iron gates of Riverside Orphanage, a place he'd never thought he'd see, let alone set foot near. He was not here for sentiment. He was not here to be moved. Business had drawn him to this part of town, or so he told himself, and nothing more. As he stood beneath his umbrella, eyeing the faded sign that promised a home to the homeless, he caught sight of a small figure half hidden beneath a battered awning. It was a girl, no more than 7, her dress several winters old, her shoes soaked through. The rain seemed to fall harder around her, as if the world itself were pressing down, but she sat very still, hugging her knees to her chest. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks, and her small hands were clenched white around the fabric of her skirt. For a moment, Charles thought she might be waiting for someone, or perhaps hiding from the matron who bustled somewhere beyond the windows. But then he realized she wasn't watching the doors, she was staring back at the orphanage itself, her eyes wide with a kind of searching sorrow that did not belong to children. It was that look, more than the setting, more than the weather, more than the faint sound of music coming from the common room inside, that caught Charles off guard. There was something unresolved in her posture, a tension as if she was holding on to a secret too large for her small body. He watched her shiver, the cold creeping up through the soles of her shoes, and felt an unfamiliar pang beneath his ribs. This was not pity. Charles Wyatt did not believe in charity, not really. It was more like recognition, though he could not say of what. The girl wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Behind the fogged glass of the orphanage doors, figures moved in and out of focus, but the girl did not seem to notice them. She was waiting, but not for comfort. A car horn blared somewhere down the street. Charles checked his watch, impatient. He was late for his meeting, and yet he did not move. The city moved around them both, uncaring, relentless. It was in that strange stillness, between the rumble of thunder and the passing of footsteps, that Charles Wyatt's world began to tilt. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. All he knew, standing there in the rain, was that something in her silence demanded attention. A billionaire does not change his life for a stranger. At least, not until he hears the one thing that will make him question everything he thought he knew about mercy, about loss, about family. And at that very moment, Charles Wyatt had no idea he was about to hear it. Charles remained by the gate longer than he intended, the rain threading down his face, running along the line of his jaw beneath the rim of his umbrella. It had been years since he had allowed himself to simply stand still, to be pulled from his schedule by something inexplicable. Every part of his life was calculated, meetings, investments, acquisitions, all of it mapped with ruthless precision. But here, outside Riverside Orphanage, logic seemed to falter, and he found himself watching the small, shivering figure with an attention bordering on fascination. The city had a way of swallowing its lost things. The orphanage, with its sagging roof and peeling paint, looked like one of those places the world had forgotten. Yet, in the haze of the rain, it seemed oddly alive, a pulse of memory, a hint of secrets buried in its crumbling walls. Charles's eyes drifted to the windows, the flicker of light and shadow within, the shapes of children moving through hallways littered with discarded shoes and outgrown toys. It was a far cry from the polished marble and soft lighting of his own world. A car rolled by, splashing water over the curb, but neither Charles nor the girl flinched. He caught himself wondering what had driven her out here, away from the relative warmth inside, to sit alone on the edge of the world. There was a loneliness in her that felt uncomfortably familiar, a kind of stubborn resolve in the way she held herself. He remembered, for a fleeting moment, the silence of his own childhood rooms, vast, echoing spaces where footsteps disappeared into velvet curtains and every kindness seemed to come with a price. He had learned early that the world was indifferent, that softness only invited disappointment. Yet this child, with her thin arms wrapped tight around her knees, seemed untouched by bitterness, even as she braced herself against the rain. There was only a quiet waiting, as if she believed, against all reason, that someone would come. Charles checked his watch again, but the numbers felt meaningless. The world he understood, the world of deadlines and bottom lines, seemed impossibly distant. Here, time slowed, each minute drawn out by the steady rhythm of the rain. He found himself counting the drops as they hit the pavement, measuring his breaths, willing himself to walk away. But his feet would not move. A faint sound caught his ear, a small, sharp sniffle, quickly smothered. The girl had pressed her face into her arms, her shoulders trembling with the effort to contain herself. It was a gesture so vulnerable, so heartbreakingly private, that Charles felt like an intruder. He looked away, ashamed by his own curiosity, but when he glanced back, she was watching him. Their eyes met for a moment that stretched and stretched, neither of them able to look away. Her gaze was searching, but not fearful. There was no accusation in it, only a deep, silent plea that made Charles's chest ache. He realized, with a jolt, that she was not waiting for rescue. She was waiting for someone to listen. Behind her, the orphanage doors swung open and closed, children coming and going in bursts of laughter and argument, but the girl remained apart, untouched by the small dramas of the day. Charles wondered if she was always this quiet, or if the rain had driven her to this edge. He considered, for a wild moment, approaching her, but something in her posture warned him off. A prickly dignity, the kind that comes from having to protect oneself too often, too soon. He remembered an old lesson: never approach a stray too quickly, or it might bolt. Instead, he leaned against the gate, pretending to study the battered garden beds and the crooked mailbox. But his attention remained fixed on her, the puzzle of her presence growing more insistent with every passing second. Inside the orphanage, a bell rang faintly, signaling the end of some afternoon routine. The children vanished from the windows, leaving the building strangely hollow. The girl did not stir. Charles tried to imagine her story, where she had come from, what loss had shaped her into this solitary silhouette. He found, to his surprise, that he wanted to know. Not out of pity, but from a need to understand something that eluded him, something that felt perilously close to regret. A memory surfaced, his own mother, her hands cool against his fevered brow, the only gentle touch he could recall. She had not stayed long in his life, carried away by illness and circumstance, but her absence had colored everything that came after. Charles wondered if the girl was waiting for someone who would never return, if she had already learned that hope could be a cruel companion. The rain began to ease, the clouds thinning as the afternoon waned. Light struggled through, turning the wet pavement to silver. Charles watched as the girl's head lifted, her eyes searching the windows, the doors, the empty street. He saw, in that moment, the way her hope flickered, fragile, battered, but still burning. It was then that he noticed the way she kept glancing at the orphanage entrance, her body tense with anticipation. She was not simply lost, she was tethered to something inside, some unspoken promise or fear. Charles felt a prickle of unease. He knew, without understanding how, that there was more at stake here than loneliness. A shadow moved behind the glass, a woman's silhouette, pausing in the dim hallway. The girl's entire body went rigid. Charles watched, heart beating faster for reasons he could not name, as the figure disappeared deeper into the building. The girl's gaze followed, her small hands twisting in her lap. Charles wondered what kept her outside. Why she did not go in. Why she looked so certain that she could not, or must not, follow. The question lodged in his mind, stubborn and unyielding. A soft wind stirred, carrying with it the faintest trace of music, an old piano, its notes stumbling through a melody Charles almost recognized. It sounded like a lullaby, or a farewell. He found himself remembering things he had spent decades trying to forget, the feeling of being small, the ache of wanting something he could not name. He realized, suddenly, that he was afraid. Not of the rain, or the cold, or even the strangeness of this place. He was afraid of the possibility that this moment mattered, that the choice he made now would echo far beyond the orphanage gates. Charles closed his umbrella, letting the rain dampen his suit. He stepped forward, unsure, his heart thudding in his chest. The girl did not move, but her eyes widened, tracking his approach with a wary hope. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. He hesitated, searching for words he did not have. The silence between them was vast, filled with everything unsaid, everything unknown. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, that someone would come, that the world was not as cruel as it seemed. But he knew, from long experience, that such promises were empty. Instead, he waited, letting the moment stretch, letting her decide. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with all the things that might be lost or found. Charles stood there, a billionaire out of place and out of time, and wondered what would happen next. He could not have known that the answer would come not in words, but in a whisper that would unravel everything he believed about himself, about mercy, about the things we owe to strangers. Inside the orphanage, a door slammed. A woman's voice called out, sharp with worry, echoing down the hall. The girl flinched, her eyes darting to the sound, her whole body trembling. Charles felt a surge of protectiveness, fierce and unexpected. He wanted to ask her who she was waiting for. He wanted to understand what sorrow had carved such depth into her young face. But before he could speak, the girl turned to him, her voice barely audible above the hush of the world returning to itself. And with that, everything shifted. Charles barely breathed, watching the girl as the last beads of rain rolled from his hair onto the damp stone beneath his feet. He had never felt so out of his depth, so entirely stripped of the armor that his wealth and reputation provided. For all his years of negotiating billion-dollar contracts and maneuvering through corporate mazes, nothing had prepared him for the silent communication between himself and this child on the orphanage stoop. The air between them seemed to hum with anticipation. Charles found himself listening as if the wind might carry some answer, as if the bricks and battered door behind her might speak for her. The orphanage itself had grown quieter, the children inside occupied with whatever routines filled their afternoons. Even the city seemed to have receded, a hush falling in which the smallest sound became significant. The girl's lips parted, uncertain, as she glanced once more at the orphanage doors. Her hands fidgeted with the frayed hem of her dress, twisting and untwisting it. Charles saw the struggle within her, the urge to speak fighting against an old habit of silence. He did not know her name or her history, but he recognized the look of someone who had learned to be careful with what she shared, someone for whom trust had become a precious and dangerous thing. He remembered his own childhood hesitations, the way he had learned to hold secrets close. But he had never been so young when he first needed to protect himself. In her, he saw an innocence tested, but not yet broken. The moment stretched, the only sound the distant drip of water from the orphanage gutters and the soft, uneven breaths she took. And then, in a voice no louder than a sigh, she whispered something that made Charles's blood run cold. Though the words themselves were nearly lost to the wind, their meaning rang clear. It was not a cry for help, not an accusation, but a statement of fact so raw that it seemed to slice through the layers of distance between them. "My mom's still inside." The words themselves barely traveled beyond the two of them, but they landed with a gravity that Charles had not felt in years. He understood at once that this was not a simple story, not a case of a child left at a doorstep or abandoned to the care of strangers. This was something else, a fracture in the usual order of things, an unresolved wound. He tried to make sense of it. The orphanage was not a place for mothers, only children. The staff inside were overworked and underpaid, tasked with feeding, clothing, and protecting dozens of little lives, but they were not family. The parents, as far as Charles knew, were always absent, by necessity, by tragedy, by design. Yet the girl's certainty left no room for confusion. Her mother was still inside. Not gone, not a memory, but somewhere beyond those faded doors. He looked at the building anew, searching the windows for any sign that something was amiss. The orphanage no longer looked simply run down or neglected. It looked haunted, as if holding on to secrets too painful for daylight. Charles realized he was gripping the handle of his umbrella so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He let it drop to the ground and stepped closer, his mind racing with questions he could not voice. What did she mean? Her mother was still inside. Was there someone hidden, sick, or trapped? Had something terrible happened, a mistake, an accident, a crime gone unnoticed by the world? Or was this the desperate hope of a child who could not accept the finality of loss? Charles had no answers, only the sudden, urgent need to find out. The girl had fallen silent again, staring at the closed doors with a look of fierce longing. Charles could see now that she was on the verge of tears, not the loud, dramatic sobs of a tantrum, but the quiet, shattering kind that adults never notice until it is too late. The kind that leaves a mark. He followed her gaze, his own heart pounding in his chest. He saw the way her small body was drawn forward, as if tethered by something invisible. He wondered how long she had been waiting, minutes, hours, days? How long since anyone had truly seen her? For the first time, Charles found himself asking what his own presence here meant. He was not a savior, not a hero. He had come to the orphanage for reasons that now felt thin and insubstantial. But as he stood beside the girl, he felt the weight of her need pressing against his own emptiness. The silence between them was now loaded with purpose. The world beyond the orphanage gates seemed impossibly far away, his business, his reputation, his carefully cultivated distance from pain and vulnerability. None of it mattered in this moment, faced with the mystery of a child and her unshakable belief that her mother was still waiting for her, just beyond reach. Charles could not walk away, not now. Something had shifted inside him, a sense of responsibility that was at once alien and familiar. He was reminded of stories he had read as a boy, tales of knights and impossible quests. He had never believed in such things. But standing here, in the fading light, he realized that sometimes the smallest voices could command the greatest acts of courage. A sense of determination settled over him. He could not abandon this child to her vigil, nor could he ignore the quiet plea hidden in her whisper. He would find out what had happened, would uncover the truth buried within the orphanage walls, no matter how uncomfortable or difficult it might be. Charles looked again at the orphanage, a place he had once seen as nothing more than another piece of neglected real estate. Now, it was something else entirely, a crucible of hope and loss, a place where the future was shaped by the choices of those who dared to care. The girl wiped her eyes on her sleeve, glancing up at Charles as if sensing his resolve. He nodded, a gesture of silent agreement. Whatever came next, he would not let her face it alone. Behind them, the city continued on, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding at the edge of its notice. But for Charles Wyatt, everything had changed. He had entered the world of the orphanage as a stranger, a man untouched by the needs of others. Now, he was part of a story he could neither predict nor escape, a story written in whispers and rain, in secrets kept too long, in the stubborn hope of a child waiting for her mother to come home. Inside the orphanage, shadows lengthened across empty halls. Somewhere, a door creaked open. The next chapter was about to begin. A heaviness seemed to settle on the world as Charles stood at the orphanage threshold, the child's words echoing quietly within him. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the roof, a slow and steady rhythm that marked the passing of time. Above them, the gray sky began to fracture, yielding reluctant streaks of late sunlight that limned the orphanage's broken shingles in fragile gold. Charles's suit was damp. He barely noticed. His mind was wholly occupied by the mystery before him, by the girl's aching certainty and the implications of her whisper. The city's distant hum receded, leaving only the sound of their breathing, the pulse of tension, and the persistent, unsettling question. Who was the mother the girl still believed was inside? How had no one noticed? What story could possibly explain her faith? The orphanage, once merely a sad shape in a tired neighborhood, had become a place full of silent accusation, its windows blank eyes watching Charles and the girl. He could feel the pressure of old secrets, the kind that gathered in corners and behind closed doors, thick as dust and just as hard to sweep away. He did not speak to the girl. There were no words for this threshold, No gentle platitudes or businesslike reassurances that would not ring hollow in the wake of her confession. Instead, he reached out, a tentative hand extended to the old iron gate, and gently pushed it open. The hinges groaned, a long, drawn sound that seemed almost to shudder with reluctance. The girl watched him, wary but attentive, as if she could not quite believe what he was about to do. Her small feet shifted on the wet stone, but she did not follow at first. Charles stepped forward slowly, so as not to frighten her, allowing the silence to fill the space between them like a soft blanket. He crossed the yard, the grass spongy beneath his shoes. His presence felt alien here, a man built for gleaming offices, moving through the wild territory of forgotten children. Yet something about the journey, however short, felt significant. It was as if he had left behind, with every step, a piece of the armor he'd carried his entire life. The orphanage door was heavy, battered by years of hands far smaller and more desperate than his own. It stuck at first, then gave way with a gentle shove. The hallway beyond was dim and quiet, lined with faded photographs and a battered corkboard pinned with outdated notices. Somewhere deeper in, a television muttered to itself, the distant voices of children arguing over a game. Charles paused just inside, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The air smelled faintly of floor polish, wet coats, and something underneath, something older, like lost time or the residue of sorrow. His instincts, always honed for advantage and opportunity, strained uselessly in this place. Here, power was measured not in money, but in kindness and attention, in small gestures that meant survival. He turned, expecting to find the girl at the door, but she lingered on the threshold, half in shadow. He realized she was waiting for permission, not from him, but from some invisible line she could not cross. He nodded, a silent invitation. After a moment, she crept forward, hugging herself tightly, her eyes darting from his face to the empty hallway ahead. Inside, the orphanage was neither welcoming nor hostile. It simply was, a place shaped by years of necessity, its beauty and joy worn thin by the endless churn of children passing through. The floors were scrubbed but stained, the paint chipped from too many careless hands. In the common room, a battered couch sagged beneath the weight of two boys staring at a flickering cartoon. Charles glanced at the girl, searching for any sign of recognition or hope, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead. He moved further in, drawn by a sense of urgency that now overrode every instinct to remain a detached observer. He was no longer just a visitor. He was, for this moment, part of her story. He moved past the common room, catching fragments of laughter and the bright, plastic clatter of toys. No one stopped him. Perhaps adults, even strangers, went unquestioned here, or perhaps the staff had simply grown weary of challenging the unexpected. The halls wound deeper, doors opening onto dormitories filled with bunks, cubbies stuffed with mismatched shoes, walls covered in childish scrawls. Charles felt the orphanage's reality settling over him, 1,000 small struggles, 1,000 tiny victories and defeats, all compressed into these narrow spaces. He glanced back to ensure the girl was still following. She was, but her steps grew slower the further they went, her posture shrinking in on itself. He wondered again about the mother she insisted was here. Had she worked in the kitchen? Was she one of the elusive staff? Or was she something more tragic, a figure lost in the shuffle, a secret kept in the name of order or convenience? The possibilities grew darker the further he followed them, yet the child's certainty was a light that would not be extinguished. They reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. It was quieter here, the sounds of the other children muted by distance. A weak bulb cast a cone of yellow light on a tiled floor. The girl hesitated at the threshold, her whole body taut with anticipation and dread. Charles felt his own heart quicken. He pushed the door open, letting the light spill into the corridor behind them. The room was small and sparsely furnished, a cot, a battered dresser, a window half obscured by a faded curtain. The air was close, heavy with the residue of too many unspoken words. The girl stood frozen, just inside the doorway. She stared at the bed, at the shape beneath the worn blanket. For a moment, Charles thought the room was empty, but then the shape stirred, a faint movement, barely perceptible. A woman lay there, impossibly thin, her hair streaked with gray though she was not yet old. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes closed, her hand curled protectively around a frayed photograph. The girl's mother. There was no mistaking the resemblance. The line of her jaw, the curve of her brow, the quiet strength, even in stillness. Charles felt the air leave his lungs. He had expected tragedy, perhaps even abandonment, but not this raw, unvarnished devotion, this child refusing to leave her mother behind even as the world had moved on. The girl moved forward at last, reaching for the woman's hand with a trembling gentleness that spoke of countless nights spent waiting, watching, hoping. He understood, then, that the story was both simpler and more complicated than he could have imagined. The orphanage had taken in the girl, but her mother had come with her, a casualty of circumstances no one cared enough to unravel. Perhaps the woman had fallen ill, or lost everything, and the system had swept them both into its embrace, separating them in all but the most essential way. Charles stood at the edge of the room, a witness to their reunion. He felt both out of place and deeply implicated, as if his presence had somehow forced the truth to the surface. The girl did not cry. She simply held her mother's hand, anchoring herself to the one thing in the world that remained. He wondered how many others passed through these doors carrying secrets and hopes, waiting for someone to see them, to recognize the simple, stubborn ties that refused to be broken. The room grew quiet, filled with the small sounds of breathing and the hush of distant voices. In that moment, Charles Wyatt felt the shape of something new forming within him, a sense of duty not born of guilt or obligation, but of understanding. He did not know what he could offer, or how he might help, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would not turn away. For the first time in a very long while, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, not just for the girl and her mother, but for himself as well. A future shaped not by profit or loss, but by the fragile, enduring hope of two people clinging to each other in the midst of loss. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, spilling light across the orphanage floor, Charles realized that sometimes all it takes to change a life is to bear witness, to stand beside the suffering, and refuse to let go. He took a breath, deep and full, and stepped further into the room, prepared to do what he could, no matter how small, no matter how late. For a long moment, time inside the small, sunlit room seemed to slow, as if the world outside the orphanage had been gently pressed on pause. Charles stood at the threshold, uncertain of his role. He was neither family nor friend, and yet in this moment, he felt oddly responsible for the fragile scene before him. The child with her hand wrapped around her mother's, the sick woman half lost in sleep and silence, the air humming with things unsaid. He let his eyes wander over the room, searching for clues in the details. A battered suitcase leaned against the dresser, half open and packed with an assortment of clothes, women's and children's, all carefully folded, as if someone still believed there might be a place to go. On the wall above the bed hung a paper star, cut unevenly by small hands and strung on faded ribbon, swaying gently with each movement in the room. There were no photographs except the one clutched tightly in the woman's hand, its corners frayed from years of anxious fingers. Charles's gaze settled on the woman's face. She was pale, her cheeks hollow, but there was a quiet dignity in the set of her jaw, a kind of stubbornness he recognized immediately in the girl. Even in sleep, she clung to the photograph as if it were a lifeline, her grip tightening whenever her dreams grew troubled. He wondered how long she had lain here, drifting between consciousness and exhaustion, while her daughter waited just beyond reach. The girl, perhaps sensing his uncertainty, glanced back at Charles. For the first time, her eyes seemed to hold a flicker of hope, a small question burning behind the worry. Would he help them? Would he turn away like so many others had done before? He nodded, slow and steady, not trusting himself to speak. The weight of the promise hung in the air between them, binding him to a course he could neither predict nor control. In the corridor outside, footsteps echoed, soft, measured, careful. A woman appeared in the doorway, her hair scraped back into a severe bun, a clipboard hugged to her chest. She paused, taking in the scene with a look of mild surprise. She was neither young nor old, her face carved with the fine lines of someone who has spent years absorbing other people's sorrows without letting them show. Charles stepped back, instinctively making room for the staff member. The woman's eyes swept over him, sizing him up in an instant. Her expression was guarded, but not unkind. She glanced from Charles to the girl and her mother, then offered a faint, practiced smile. He expected her to ask who he was, what he was doing in a private room, but instead she knelt beside the bed and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from the sleeping woman's forehead. There was tenderness in the gesture, but also a certain weary detachment, as if she had learned to give just enough to ease suffering without being consumed by it. "She has good days and bad days," the woman said quietly, her voice soft enough not to disturb the sleeper. "Mostly bad, lately. We do what we can, but there are limits. The doctors come when they can. It's the waiting that's hardest, for both of them." Charles wanted to ask why the girl and her mother were still here, why they had not been separated by the bureaucracy of the system. He did not know the rules of such places, only the cold efficiency of business and the law. But the answer hovered unspoken in the silence. Sometimes, the world simply forgot people who slipped through the cracks, leaving them to depend on the kindness of strangers. The staff woman rose, smoothing her skirt. She regarded Charles with polite curiosity, as if debating whether to ask his business. Instead, she nodded to the girl, her tone softening. "Your mother will sleep for a while yet, Emily. Would you like to come and help with the supper trays?" Emily shook her head, shrinking closer to her mother. Her refusal was quiet, but absolute. The staff woman only nodded, unsurprised. "Stay as long as you need," she said, and left as quickly as she had come, her footsteps receding down the hallway. Charles was left with the weight of the room again, the air thick with worry and fatigue. He drew up a chair beside the bed, unsure if he was intruding or offering comfort. The girl, Emily, watched him, uncertainty still shadowing her gaze. It was then, as the light shifted through the window, that Charles began to sense the outlines of the story beneath the surface. Emily's mother was clearly unwell, kept here more by necessity than by choice. The orphanage was not equipped for sick adults, but for some reason, bureaucratic oversight, or a rare act of mercy, they had not forced a separation. Instead, mother and daughter had been allowed to drift together on the edges of the system, surviving on scraps of compassion and hope. He imagined the fear that must have accompanied every day. The worry that someone would arrive with paperwork and polite apologies, sending Emily to a foster home and her mother to a hospital or, worse, the streets. In the absence of anyone who cared enough to intervene, they had simply been left alone, two fragile lives bound together, waiting for a rescue that might never come. Charles wondered how many others lived this way, tucked away in forgotten corners, invisible to all but those who cared enough to look. He thought of his own childhood again, the ways he had learned to disappear, to make himself invisible in a house full of absence. He had survived in part by never asking for help, never letting anyone close enough to see his fears. Yet here he was, drawn into the heart of a struggle he could not ignore. The promise he had made with a nod now felt heavier, more urgent. He did not know how to help, only that he must. The afternoon wore on, the room gradually filling with the golden light of early evening. Emily drifted off to sleep beside her mother, her small body curled protectively against the woman's side. Charles watched them, feeling an unfamiliar ache in his chest, a longing not just to save them, but to understand them, to bear witness to the love and courage that kept them going despite everything. He thought of the resources at his disposal, the power, the money, the connections he had spent a lifetime building. None of it seemed designed for this kind of need, for the simple act of keeping a family together in a world determined to tear them apart. He realized, with a mix of frustration and hope, that he would have to find another way. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor, Charles rose quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping pair. He slipped from the room, moving through the orphanage's winding halls with a new sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a stranger in his own life. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to follow it, wherever it led. Back in the small room, Emily's mother stirred, her eyes flickering open. For a brief moment, she seemed to sense the change in the air, the presence of hope, fragile but real, hovering at the edge of her dreams. She squeezed her daughter's hand, whispering a silent prayer to the fading light. In the corridors outside, Charles paused, listening to the hum of the orphanage, the laughter and squabbles, the quiet acts of kindness, the pulse of survival. He felt himself changed by it, reoriented by the force of a single child's hope and the unyielding bond that had pulled him, at last, into something greater than himself. The story was far from over. But for the first time, Charles believed there might be a way forward, one built not on profit or ambition, but on the simple, stubborn faith that love, however battered, can still change everything. Evening settled gently over the orphanage, softening the edges of the day with the promise of rest. The building seemed to grow quieter as the last of the sunlight faded, the laughter of children replaced by the clatter of dishes in the kitchen and the hum of a vacuum somewhere down the hall. In the small room where Emily and her mother slept, a sense of peace hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Charles found himself moving through the hallways as if in a trance, the day's events replaying in his mind. The questions that had troubled him earlier had not vanished. If anything, they had multiplied. Who was this woman, really? What had happened to bring her and her daughter to the orphanage's door? How long could such an arrangement be sustained, two lives balanced on the thin edge of charity and chance? He passed a faded mural painted along one corridor, children holding hands beneath a painted sun, their faces a blur of colors and hopeful smiles. He paused, reading the names scrawled beneath the figures, some of them already unfamiliar to the staff who had inherited their stories. The names were a reminder, so many came and went, each leaving behind a ghost of themselves in chipped paint and worn wood. Charles continued to the front office, where a single lamp illuminated a battered desk stacked high with paperwork. The woman with the severe bun, Mrs. Dalton, as the nameplate read, was working late, a cup of cold tea beside her and reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. She did not look up as Charles entered, scribbling something on a form before finally glancing in his direction. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. Mrs. Dalton watched him, her eyes sharp behind the lenses, not unkind but clearly accustomed to visitors who came with questions and left with little resolved. Charles found himself oddly nervous, as if he were a child again, asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. He asked, as gently as he could, about Emily and her mother. He tried not to sound accusatory, but the weight of his concern made his voice firmer than he intended. Mrs. Dalton's expression did not change, though a flicker of fatigue crossed her features. She set down her pen, folding her hands atop the paperwork. Mrs. Dalton explained that Emily and her mother Sarah had come to Riverside 2 months ago, just as winter was deepening. There had been no one else, no family, no friends, no other place to go. Sarah had fallen ill soon after their arrival, and though social services had made promises of medical help and new placement, nothing had come of it. The system, she said with a tired shrug, worked slowly when it worked at all. In the meantime, they did what they could, a bed, some food, the comfort of staying together. Mrs. Dalton admitted that she bent the rules sometimes. She smiled, just a little, as if daring him to judge her for it. Charles did not. Instead, he felt a new respect for the woman before him, a quiet rebel fighting for dignity in a world too quick to discard it. He asked what could be done, what would happen next. Mrs. Dalton shook her head. Without outside intervention, she said, there were few options. A proper hospital might take Sarah, but it would almost certainly mean separation from Emily. The foster system would send the girl to strangers. The likelihood of reunification, once the wheels started turning, was slim. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, as someone who had learned the cost of false hope. A heavy silence settled between them. Charles thought of all the doors his fortune could open, the lawyers, the doctors, the programs he could call into being with a single phone call. But he also understood that this was a world in which power often did more harm than good. The wrong move could shatter the fragile peace Emily and her mother had found. He promised to help, and for once, he meant it in a way that was not performative or transactional. Mrs. Dalton gave him a searching look, then, apparently satisfied, nodded and offered him a chair. They talked as the office darkened, sharing what little information there was, Sarah's former address, a note from a neighbor, a half-remembered employer's name, a vague report from a social worker who had not returned. The longer they spoke, the clearer it became to Charles that there were no easy solutions, no dramatic rescues waiting in the wings. If Emily and her mother were to have a future together, it would not be because the system had suddenly found its heart, but because ordinary people had refused to let them be forgotten. Charles rose to leave as the orphanage bell sounded for evening meal. Mrs. Dalton watched him go, her eyes following him down the hallway with a glimmer of hope, or perhaps only relief, that someone outside these walls cared enough to try. In the dining room, Charles watched children line up for their supper, some laughing, some jostling, others silent with exhaustion. He caught sight of Emily among them, moving quietly, her gaze distant. She carried a tray with careful hands, glancing now and then toward the doorway as if afraid the fragile piece she'd found might vanish at any moment. He sat nearby, letting the warmth and noise of the meal wash over him. He saw in these children echoes of his own loneliness, and wondered at the resilience that allowed them to find comfort even here, among strangers and second-hand belongings. After dinner, as dusk fell and the children drifted toward their beds, Charles wandered outside. The air was cool, scented with rain and fresh earth. Lights flickered on in the orphanage windows, small beacons in the growing dark. He thought about what it would mean to keep his promise, not just to Emily and her mother, but to himself. He knew now that it would require more than a donation, more than a signature on a check. It would mean time, attention, and a willingness to let their lives affect his own. A child's laughter rang out behind him, breaking his reverie. He turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her face lit by the soft glow from within. She did not speak, but the look she gave him was enough. A simple, wordless trust, fragile and astonishing, placed in his hands. As he left the orphanage that night, Charles felt the world shift beneath his feet. He no longer saw the city as an indifferent machine, but as a tapestry of small, hidden struggles, each demanding more than a passing glance, each asking for the kind of hope that changes everything. He understood now that there were many ways to be a billionaire. Some counted their worth in dollars and stock options. Others, though fewer, found it in the lives they chose to see, and the hearts they refused to let break alone. The street outside was quiet, the rain long since passed. Charles stood beneath the faded sign, feeling the gravity of the choice before him, and for the first time in years, he found himself grateful for the uncertainty of what might come next. Inside, Emily climbed into bed beside her mother, safe for one more night. The promise of tomorrow hung between them, fragile, real, and utterly new. Morning at the orphanage arrived with a soft gray light, the city outside still hushed and slow. For the first time since his arrival, Charles felt the strange peace of early hours, the gentle sound of dishes in the kitchen, the sleepy shuffle of children climbing from bed, the occasional muffled cough in the hallway. Rain had washed the night clean. The garden glistened, petals and leaves jeweled with dew. It all seemed impossibly delicate, too easily swept away by the chaos waiting outside. Charles had not slept well. His dreams were uneasy, full of faces and voices he could not place, memories of childhood loneliness bleeding into the present. When he dressed that morning, he looked in the cracked mirror of his modest guest room and found a man marked by exhaustion but also by something harder to define. A kind of resolve, as if the previous day had set in motion changes he could no longer resist. He joined the staff and children in the breakfast room, not bothering to keep his distance as he might have done before. The children, curious but respectful, kept glancing at him. Their acceptance was casual, their eyes already accustomed to the comings and goings of adults, both well-meaning and indifferent. Only Emily seemed to watch him closely, her gaze steady and measuring, as if she were trying to decide what kind of promise he truly represented. He saw that her mother was not at the table. Emily ate slowly, always glancing toward the corridor leading back to the bedrooms. The staff were quieter than usual, their smiles tight, their movements brisk. Charles sensed an unspoken worry hovering over the meal, a tension that made the porridge taste bland and the sunlight seem uncertain. After breakfast, he made his way down the now familiar hallway, pausing at Sarah's door. The room was dimmer than before, curtains half drawn. Emily's mother slept deeply, her breathing shallow but steady, one hand curled beneath her cheek as if shielding herself from dreams. Charles found himself wishing, absurdly, that he could simply will her back to health, that the force of his hope could repair what life had broken. He sat for a while in the silence, thinking of the questions he needed to answer and the obstacles still in his way. What would happen if the authorities discovered the truth? How long could Mrs. Dalton protect them, bending the rules before someone noticed? And what would become of Emily if the day came when her mother could not get out of bed at all? These thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Dalton appeared, carrying a file in her arms, her face clouded with worry. She asked Charles if he might have a word. He followed her to the small office at the front of the building, the tension in her shoulders warning him before she spoke. There had been a call. Social services had flagged Sarah's case for urgent review. Someone, somewhere, had realized that an adult was residing at Riverside in violation of regulations. An inspector would arrive by week's end, perhaps sooner. Mrs. Dalton's voice was calm, but her hands trembled just slightly as she described the likely outcome. Sarah would be taken to a hospital or long-term care, Emily placed in foster care with strangers. The chances of keeping them together, slim at best. Charles felt the old anger, sharp and hot, rising beneath his skin. Not at Mrs. Dalton, who had fought for Emily and her mother with every scrap of authority she had, but at the faceless machinery that reduced lives to case numbers and policies. He remembered the feeling of being invisible, of having no say in his own fate, and his jaw tightened with the memory. He asked what could be done, really done, not just delayed or obscured. Mrs. Dalton had few answers. Money would help, but only so much. The real barrier was time. The time needed to convince the right people, to gather the right paperwork, to find a way to keep Emily with her mother legally and safely. She suggested quietly that perhaps Charles could reach someone who mattered, someone who might move more quickly if asked the right way. He agreed at once, but the old tools of persuasion, negotiation, leverage, the gentle threat of publicity or withdrawal, felt wrong here. He would have to be careful, not just powerful. Any wrong step could ruin everything. That morning, Charles began making calls. He reached out to lawyers who owed him favors, doctors who remembered the kindness of an old donation, even journalists who might shine a light on the case if subtle pressure was needed. Each call was measured, strategic, but also personal in a way that surprised him. For once, his connections were not shields, they were lifelines, thrown across a chasm he had never dared cross before. But even as he worked, he was aware of how fragile it all was. Emily's hope, Sarah's life, the daily rhythms of the orphanage, they hung by the slenderest of threads. Every knock at the door could bring relief or disaster. Every promise made was a test of whether the world would finally care enough to help. By noon, Charles was exhausted but more determined than ever. He spent the rest of the day with Emily, helping her carry books to the little reading nook in the sunroom, listening as she described, in her quiet way, the stories she liked best. Her favorite was about a mother and daughter who built a house from nothing and found, in the end, that love could be a kind of shelter all its own. As dusk approached, Charles watched the sky turn lavender through the window. He thought of how little he had truly understood about loss, about love, about the power of simply being present. He had lived his life as if compassion were an indulgence, something to be distributed after profit and security. Now, he saw that it was the thing that mattered most, the only thing, in the end, that could hold the world together. In the quiet hours after dinner, when the orphanage had grown calm, Charles stood once more at the doorway of Sarah's room. Emily was reading softly to her mother, her voice steady and clear. Charles leaned against the doorframe, letting the words wash over him, and realized he had crossed a boundary he could never uncross. He belonged to this story now, for better or worse. In the fragile hope of that evening, he saw a way forward, not easy, not guaranteed, but real. He understood, at last, that saving one family might not change the world, but it would change everything for the only two people who mattered right now. And perhaps, in the quiet spaces of his own heart, it would change him too. The orphanage settled into sleep, the lights flickering off one by one. Charles stood in the hallway, the echo of Emily's voice lingering in the dark, and prepared for the fight to come. The days that followed seemed to stretch and contract in equal measure, time folding in on itself with each new uncertainty. The atmosphere at the orphanage was taut, every adult exchanging wary glances, every child picking up on the subtle vibrations of anxiety in the air. The youngest clung tighter to their caregivers. The older ones became more watchful, as if sensing a coming storm. Charles felt it most acutely in the stillness just before dawn, when the city outside was hushed and the orphanage lay suspended between hope and dread. He rose earlier than usual, pacing the cold linoleum floors, letting his thoughts unfurl in the dimness. It wasn't just the fear of failure that kept him awake, it was the knowledge that so much depended on a few unpredictable moments, and that all his usual strengths, his influence and wealth, might prove useless against the machinery of fate. He spent long hours with Mrs. Dalton, combing through paperwork and contacts, searching for loopholes and backup plans. Together they pored over old files, dug up every scrap of documentation that might persuade an inspector to grant clemency. The work was painstaking, each small victory offset by 100 uncertainties. Sometimes they stopped just to sit in silence, drinking tea gone cold and listening to the distant, reassuring chaos of the children at play. Emily moved through these days with quiet alertness, never far from her mother's side. She seemed to shrink whenever Charles or Mrs. Dalton mentioned visitors or important meetings. She understood, in the instinctive way of children, that something was at stake, something bigger than rules or grown-up explanations. Charles often found her in the reading nook, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes bright with worry but refusing to cry. Sarah, meanwhile, improved in small, stubborn increments. She managed to sit up some mornings, accepting a few bites of breakfast, listening as Emily recounted the day's small adventures. Her voice was weak, but her spirit was intact. She thanked Charles in whispers, her gratitude edged with caution. She was not used to kindness that came with no strings attached. Her eyes, so like Emily's, carried both hope and the weariness of someone who had learned not to expect miracles. The news of the inspector's imminent arrival set the orphanage on edge. The staff doubled down on routines, checking every hallway, straightening every sheet. Charles recognized the familiar choreography of people preparing for scrutiny, that old, nervous dance of making sure nothing important was left undone. Yet even their best efforts could not erase the underlying vulnerability. One official report, one cold assessment, could unravel everything. On the morning of the inspection, the orphanage was unnaturally quiet. The children were asked to stay in their rooms or outside in the garden, and the staff wore their best uniforms, faces set with practiced smiles. Mrs. Dalton gave Charles a brief, reassuring nod before stepping into her role as caretaker and defender. Charles himself felt strangely powerless, an outsider forced to wait as strangers measured lives by rules and checklists. The inspector arrived without fanfare, a middle-aged woman with an efficient air and a folder tucked beneath her arm. She moved through the building with professional detachment, asking polite questions, peering into rooms, making notes with a mechanical click of her pen. She paused outside Sarah's door, considering the file Mrs. Dalton handed her, her eyes flickering between the paperwork and the sleeping woman on the bed. Charles watched every movement, every expression, searching for clues. He offered what explanations he could, careful not to overstep. He spoke of Sarah's illness, of Emily's need for stability, of the orphanage's care and compassion. He did not mention money, or power, or any of the things that might have bought compliance elsewhere. Here, those things felt out of place, almost vulgar. The inspector asked her questions, listened to the answers, and nodded. Her face revealed nothing, her pen continuing its steady, relentless march down the page. For a moment, it seemed possible that all their efforts would be for nothing, that Sarah would be moved, Emily relocated, and the delicate balance of hope and fear would shatter. But then something shifted. The inspector paused, glancing once more at Emily, who stood beside her mother's bed, refusing to look away. Perhaps she saw the stubborn thread of loyalty in the girl's stance, or the way Mrs. Dalton lingered just behind, ready to defend them both. Perhaps she recognized, in the worn edges of the room, the signs of a family clinging to each other despite everything. She made a final note, closed her file, and turned to Mrs. Dalton with a quiet word. Charles could not hear what was said, but he saw the relief break across Mrs. Dalton's face, a subtle loosening of the shoulders, a small, grateful smile. The inspector nodded at Charles, then at Sarah and Emily, her professional detachment softened for just a heartbeat by something more human. When she left, the tension broke like a fever. Mrs. Dalton let out a shaky breath. Emily climbed onto the bed and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, her silent joy more powerful than any words. Charles found himself blinking back an unexpected sting of tears, relief and gratitude mingling in a way that felt both overwhelming and profoundly ordinary. That evening, the orphanage was transformed. The children's laughter returned, echoing down the halls. The staff smiled with real warmth. Even Sarah seemed brighter, her eyes clearing for the first time in days. Emily's hand never left her mother's, and for the first time, the little girl allowed herself to hope, not just for another day, but for all the days that might follow. Charles stood outside in the cool air, watching the lights come on one by one. He realized, in the hush after the storm, that he had witnessed something rare. The victory of kindness, the quiet strength of ordinary people refusing to let a family be lost. He did not know what the future would bring. But tonight, for the first time, the future felt like something worth believing in. Evening descended like a gentle benediction, and for the first time in weeks the orphanage glowed not with anxiety, but with a quiet sense of triumph. It was not a loud or public victory, not the sort of celebration that called for banners or cake. Instead, it was a series of small, ordinary miracles. Laughter at the dinner table, relaxed shoulders, the sound of children's footsteps not edged with tension but with the simple desire to play. Relief, in its purest form, had a flavor all its own, a sweetness that hung in the air like the promise of spring. Charles found himself lingering after supper, content to sit unnoticed as the world of the orphanage spun on around him. He listened as the older children invented a card game with rules that changed every hand, watched as the younger ones curled up in the corners with battered stuffed animals and comic books. Even the staff moved differently tonight, their habitual caution replaced by easy smiles and soft jokes traded in the hallways. The threat of separation, of bureaucratic cruelty, had been kept at bay for now. He saw Emily sitting with her mother near the sunlit window, a picture book open between them. Sarah's color was a little better this evening, her voice stronger as she read aloud in fits and starts. Emily listened intently, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. From time to time, Sarah would pause, and Emily would quietly finish the sentence for her, the two voices weaving together like the two halves of a single song. Charles watched them, feeling an ache he could not name, a longing, perhaps, for something he'd always been too guarded to risk. As twilight gathered, he was drawn to the edge of the garden, where the scent of wet grass and budding flowers drifted on the air. He heard footsteps behind him, soft, careful, and turned to find Emily. She stood for a moment, uncertain, then took a seat beside him on the low wall. They were silent for a while. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, the city beyond the fence just beginning to twinkle to life. Charles did not press her for words, and in this quiet, she seemed to relax for the first time, her guard lowered. She studied him in the fading light with an honesty children have when they sense someone means what they say. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft but steady. She asked if her mother would get better now, if they could stay together forever. Her question was as enormous as it was simple, cutting to the heart of everything Charles had come to feel for her. He wished he could answer with certainty, wished the world could be bent to a child's need just by wanting it enough. He told her the truth, gently, that he would do everything he could, that Mrs. Dalton would fight for them too, that sometimes grown-ups really could keep their promises. He explained that life was not always fair, but that tonight they had won, and sometimes, one night of safety could grow into many more. Emily listened, absorbing every word, then nodded. She thanked him in her shy, careful way. She did not need to say more. The trust was in her eyes. In that moment, Charles felt an unfamiliar lightness, a sense that the walls he'd built around himself had begun to crumble, stone by stone. As darkness settled fully, Charles returned inside, walking the halls now filled with the gentle hush of bedtime. He stopped at Sarah's room, finding her awake and reading. She looked up, and for the first time, she did not look away in embarrassment or fear. She thanked him too, not for charity, but for seeing them, for standing beside them when no one else had. Charles sat with her for a while, sharing a quiet conversation about futures and hopes, about what came next, about the small steps that might build a different life. They spoke not as savior and supplicant, but as equals joined by something deeper than circumstance, a mutual recognition of how fragile and how valuable a family could be. In the orphanage, sleep spread gently from room to room. Mrs. Dalton turned off the last of the lights, pausing in the hallway to watch Charles, Sarah, and Emily together, her face creased with a private satisfaction. For one night, the world had bent toward justice. For one night, goodness had quietly prevailed. Outside, rain threatened again, a low rumble promising another uncertain dawn. But inside, beneath the patched roof and tired paint, hope moved quietly through the rooms, laying claim to the future in small but irrevocable ways. Charles understood at last that the real miracle was not what he could give, but what he had learned to receive. The trust of a child, the gratitude of a mother, the sense that, at least for now, he belonged in the story he had stumbled into. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, for the first time, none of them seemed insurmountable. Morning broke with the softest light, the city outside just stirring awake. The orphanage was hushed, its walls holding the peace of a night well earned. Charles awoke in his small guest room feeling a sense of calm, the heavy ache of worry replaced by something gentler and unfamiliar. He dressed slowly, savoring the rare absence of urgency, and stepped out into the hall, his footsteps muted by the old wooden floor. Downstairs, the day began in the ordinary ways. Children's laughter, the clink of spoons against bowls, the low murmur of staff sharing quiet conversation over coffee. The fear and tension of the days before seemed a distant memory, replaced by a current of quiet confidence. Even the building itself seemed lighter, the sun streaming through the windows in bright, generous bands. He found Emily and Sarah at their usual table, sharing toast and jam. Sarah looked tired, but her eyes were bright, her face animated as she helped Emily tie her shoes and brush crumbs from her lap. Emily's smile was softer, no longer tinged with that haunted shadow of uncertainty. She greeted Charles with a simple, "Good morning," as if it had always been this way, as if he belonged here. Mrs. Dalton joined them a few minutes later, carrying news. The inspector's report had arrived, and for now, Sarah and Emily could stay. The authorities, she said, had been moved by the family's resilience and the clear care shown by the orphanage staff. There would be follow-up visits, more paperwork, but the threat of separation had receded, at least for now. It was not a perfect solution, nor a permanent one, but it was enough, a door left open, a future not yet decided but not foreclosed. Charles felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he saw what it meant to make a difference not by grand gestures or financial power, but simply by being present, bearing witness, and refusing to walk away when it mattered most. He realized, as he listened to Emily chatter about her dreams for spring, that he was no longer a visitor or a benefactor. He had become a part of something, an unlikely, beautiful community woven from the threads of loss and stubborn hope. Before leaving, Charles met with Mrs. Dalton and promised ongoing support. Not just money, but time, attention, and advocacy for the children who called the orphanage home. They spoke of repairs the building needed, of after-school programs, of partnerships with clinics and schools. Charles made plans, but more than that, he made promises he intended to keep. He understood now that real change was slow, built one small act at a time. Later, he walked the garden with Sarah, who spoke softly of gratitude and fear, of how hard it was to hope and how necessary it still remained. She thanked him for listening, for seeing them as they were, for helping in ways that did not diminish their dignity. Emily ran ahead, chasing the first butterflies of the season, her laughter carrying across the bright green lawn. When it was time to go, Charles lingered at the gate, watching as Emily waved to him, her face open and fearless. He promised to return soon. For the first time, he meant it not out of obligation, but out of longing, a genuine desire to remain part of this story, to build something lasting with the people he had come to care for. As he drove away, the city spread before him as it always had, busy and indifferent. But Charles felt changed, remade in some quiet, essential way. He had entered the orphanage as a stranger, armored by wealth and solitude. He left as a witness to courage and love, his own heart lighter for the trust he'd been given. At Riverside Orphanage, the day continued, full of work and laughter, challenges and hope. And somewhere in the midst of all that ordinary, hard-won living, the impossible had happened. A girl and her mother had been allowed to stay together, not by miracle, but by the simple, powerful refusal to give up. And for Charles Wyatt, that was enough. He drove on, toward whatever new beginning awaited, certain now that the smallest voices, when truly heard, could change even the most guarded of hearts.